What's up guys, welcome back to a brand new episode of Bonsai-U. This time around we're going to be talking about Cypress obtusa or Hinoki Cypress. Alright, so a few weeks ago we did an episode of Bonsai-U featuring a Sekka Hinoki, which is a dwarf cultivar of Cypress obtusa. Well, in this episode, we're going to be talking about standard Cypress obtusa and also some other cultivars, including what I've got right here next to me, which is a Wells Select. Now, each of these different cultivars is going to have a slightly different foliar characteristic. The standard Yama Hinoki or standard Cypress obtusa that you find in the mountains in Japan will have a much larger fan-shaped foliage that's quite elongated. If you work with something like a Nanogracilis or a Wells Select like this, the foliage is going to be quite a bit more compact. Sometimes the foliage will be fan-like, like the Yama Hinoki. Sometimes it'll be a little bit more twisted and contorted, sort of like the Nanogracilis, and there's everything in between. So each of those is going to be pruned a little bit differently and approached slightly differently. In this episode though, like I said, we're going to be working on this Wells Select. Now let me tell you a little bit about this cultivar right here. I actually went up to Long Island a couple years back to do a workshop with the Long Island Bonsai Society up there. Great group of people, awesome accents, one of my favorite places that I've been so far. While I was there, a good buddy of mine, Patrick, took me out to a wholesale grower who was growing hundreds of thousands of different plants, different species, all sorts of stuff all over Long Island. He had acres and acres and acres of plants in the ground. One special tree that he had was this Wells Select. He had hundreds of them in the ground. So I requested that he dig up 100 of these guys, and then I flew back up the following spring to pick these guys up. I had to make 2 trips in a 28-foot box truck to get all of these trees back down to Tennessee. Each one of them originally weighed somewhere between 100 to 250 pounds, depending on the size of the root ball. So these were quite large trees. Now, this was a year ago in April, so April 2019. These were balled and burlapped, brought down to Tennessee. We left them in the burlap for a full year, and then in the spring, April of 2020, I potted some of these guys up, and this is one of those trees now potted in a ceramic container. Now, I wasn't sure if we were going to be able to work on this guy this year because when you do heavy root work on a Hinoki Cypress, they tend to get a little bit weak in the subsequent growing season. But much to my surprise, this tree has really flushed out nicely, so we're going to be able to dive in to the work on this plant today. So I'm really excited about that and excited to take you guys through this process. So before we do anything, I want to bring you guys in a little bit closer here, and we're going to talk about a couple of different approaches to pruning Hinoki Cypress so you can understand aesthetically what we're going to go for with this tree. And then we're going to dive into how we're actually going to design this plant, looking at the flaws and the features of the tree. Okay, so there are 2 basic ways that you can prune a Hinoki Cypress in the early summer. Now, when this video comes out, it's going to be a little bit later in the summer. I'm actually performing these techniques in early to mid-June, which is pretty standard in a Northern Hemisphere temperate climate to be doing this type of cutback or pruning on a Hinoki Cypress. So just keep that in mind. The video release date's not going to actually line up necessarily when it's the right time to do the technique, but at least you'll have this information going into next growing season. Now, with those 2 separate types of techniques, one is a pinching technique and the other is a cutting technique using scissors. Now, you've probably seen a video or 2 of me online working on this very famous Hinoki Cypress at Fujikawa-san's nursery, Eisei-en in Osaka, where I did my apprenticeship. This is a very, very famous Hinoki Cypress. As a matter of fact, it's probably in the top 3 to 5 best Hinoki Cypress in all of Japan, and therefore in all of the world. This tree was originally collected in the mountains of Japan prior to World War II, and every year, twice a year since it was collected, it has been pinched back in the same manner. Now, this tree is a Yama Hinoki or just standard Cypress obtusa, and again, if you've ever seen the foliage on these guys in nature, you'll know that they have very elongated fan-like foliage. So when this tree was collected, it had that same type of foliage, but through pinching year after year in early June and again in September, the foliage has naturally become more compact over time. As a matter of fact, if you see this tree in person, it almost looks like a dwarf cultivar of Hinoki Cypress now just because of the pinching. Now, some of you may not like the aesthetic look of the tree because when you do pinch a Hinoki Cypress like this, you are going to end up with a bit more sort of pom-pommy type looking branches on the tree essentially. Now, if you do it correctly, they won't look like your standard pom-poms that you might see out in a landscape like a niwaki or garden tree, for example, but they definitely don't look really natural either. So for some trees it really works aesthetically, and for other trees it doesn't. In my opinion, for that particular Hinoki cypress, pinching has created a really nice, interesting aesthetic that's very unique, and I actually like that look on that particular tree. Now, the second type of technique is actually using scissors to cut the foliage rather than pinching the foliage. The result of doing that is a much softer, more natural looking foliage on the tree. I prefer to use the scissor technique on trees that already have compact foliage to them, so some of the more dwarf type cultivars, or just trees that have a little bit tighter foliage to them, even if it's a standard Chamaecyparis obtusa. So with the Wells Select here, you'll notice that that foliage is already pretty compact. So I don't think it's necessary to pinch this. We are actually going to cut it, and I'm going to show you what that technique looks like here in just a second. Now again, this is all dictated by the foliage size on the tree that's naturally there, and also the aesthetic that you're going for with the design of the tree. So we're going to be diving into the cutting technique next. Okay, so let's take a look at this branch right here. Now you'll notice out here at the very end, all of this fluorescent green foliage out here, that's the new foliage from this year that has emerged since the spring season. So this is a good indication that the tree is quite healthy and we can actually work on it at this time of year. Now, with a pinching technique, we would just grab this out here and actually pinch back by hand all of the foliage out at the very end. So all of that fluorescent green out here, we would essentially remove that back to slightly older growth, and then it would flush again from those same areas. Again, that's going to give you a more compact type look, but it may not look very natural. So again, with this tree, what we want to do is actually the cutback technique with scissors. So instead of pinching all this back, if I want to shorten the length of the branch out here, or if I just want to keep the general profile of the branch out here, what I can do is actually take my scissors and come in between the individual pieces of foliage here and cut back to whatever desired profile that I want. So I could come back into here, or if I wanted to push this back even further, we could come all the way back down to here, for example, and cut the actual hardwood shoot itself, as long as we're leaving some of that green foliage intact out here. So it's actually a very easy technique to perform. It's very similar to pruning junipers, whether that be Itoigawa, any Junipers chinensis, or even Rocky Mountain junipers, 1C junipers, Sabina junipers. You would treat them essentially the same way as I'm treating this tree right here. So cutting back again in between the individual tips of foliage here and pushing that general profile back. So one thing I want to mention here while we're on the subject of pruning is that with Hinoki cypress, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get these guys to back bud further back in on old wood, on lignified branches. So if you come across a Hinoki cypress that has zero internal foliage on it at all, and it's just a hollow shell basically, so you've got the foliar canopy on the outside and nothing on the interior, you might want to set that one aside and find something that already has a little bit of interior foliage on it. You can help maintain that interior foliage by doing this type of cutback in early to mid-June and cleaning the tree out to allow light to penetrate to those inner areas. Really in a similar manner to what we've talked about before with some of the deciduous trees. This is just a different technique to get that light to the interior. Now, one cool thing about Wells Select, this particular cultivar right here, is that it tends to maintain its inner foliage slightly better than a lot of other Chamaecyparis obtusa. So for me, this is one of those species that really does lend itself well to bonsai culture. But again, if we didn't do this type of prune back, if I didn't remove the undersides of the foliage here, which we're going to be doing coming up here in a few minutes to let light to the interior, or if I didn't remove unnecessary branches this time of year to let that light to the inside, that interior foliage would likely die off even on a Wells Select over the course of 1, 2, or 3 growing seasons. So definitely keep that in mind. All right, so now for the fun part of this Bonsai-U episode, and that is figuring out how we're going to design this Hinoki cypress. So we've essentially got 2 options for the front. One is what you're looking at right here, and the other is the exact opposite side of the tree. When I potted this guy up in the spring, I took into consideration what we might want to utilize as the front and potted it on what I thought would be the best angle here. Now, the cool thing about this tree is it is essentially kind of a formal upright, so the trunk is relatively straight. It does have a little bit of curvature to it, so maybe kind of a mix between formal upright and informal upright. But in either case, because of that simple movement of the trunk, I planted it on this angle so you can see just a little bit of that curve from this side, or if I flip it around to the other side, you can see that same curvature right there. If you look at it from either the left or the right side, not really that interesting. The trunk's actually a little bit thinner from both of these sides as well, and you lose that curvature to the trunk. So either one of these 2 sides, either here or here, I think are going to be the best options. Now, we got to talk about some of the flaws within the tree, and then we're going to figure out if we can hide those flaws, eliminate those flaws, and then also what the features of the tree are, and figure out if we can show those features off. So I always like to start at the base of the tree when I'm doing this and look at the Nabari, or the surface root structure. So from this particular front right here that you're looking at the tree from, you'll notice that we've got some seriously crossing and girdling roots. One massive root right here that's actually coming up and over the front of the trunk and starting to girdle the base of the tree. Not really an ideal situation. This is something you're going to find when you're dealing with stuff that's been field grown or that's been even container grown for nursery stock. The roots will not have been worked properly for bonsai culture right from the get-go, so you will run into problems like this with roots girdling the trunk. Now we can correct for that, so this may not be the death knell for this side of the tree as the front, but we need to keep that in mind that that's a pretty big flaw right there. All right, let's flip the tree around to the other side and look at the Nabari as well. If you look at it from this side, still have a little bit of crossing rootage going on here, but it's not as severe and as obvious as the other side. So this side would actually get my vote just based on the Nabari as being probably the better potential front for the tree. That being said, let's move a little bit further up into the trunk line of the plant here. So again, regardless of which side of the tree that you view it from, you're seeing essentially the same curvature to the trunk. It's got that nice sort of soft, elegant single bend to it right through the middle of the tree. Very little taper, but still enough taper to make it interesting so it looks good from both sides. So for me, either side in this case, like I said before, could work pretty well for the front of the tree. So this side right here with the better Nabari and a decent movement in the trunk line. So this side gets 2 points. The other side over here, 0 for the Nabari and 1 for the trunk. So we got 2 to 1 going on at this point. All right, let's take a look at this side again here, moving further up into the tree and looking at the branch structure of the plant. Now, the nice thing about branches is that you can move them and manipulate them. So even if they're not really in the best position, you can actually put them in a better spot. So, it doesn't really matter necessarily where those branches are. That being said, sometimes you wind up with a situation where the branches are nearly perfect where they are from one view, and there's going to be a lot more work in moving those branches from the other view. And that's actually the case with this tree. So if you notice from this front right here, the branches are all protruding from the sides or from the back, which is a really ideal situation when you're designing coniferous material. If you have a lot of branches coming out of the front of the tree, it's really difficult to manipulate those branches out and around without then exposing the point where those branches emerge from the trunk, and then you see that shoulder of the branch as it emerges. It's not really a nice aesthetic, it looks quite messy. So if we can find a front that's got a lot of branches from the side or from the back that we can whip around and manipulate into place, it looks better. Plus it gives you more depth to the plant. So the branching from this side of the tree really provides that benefit. I mean, we're having most of those branches from the side and the back already in the right spot. A majority of these, because this is a well select, they're already on a nice downward angle naturally. So just the look of the branches from this side to me is awesome, even though we've got a crappy Nabari down here. So let's flip it around to the back side. Now again, you'll notice here that a lot of the branches now are coming directly out towards the front. We got this guy here, we've got all of this foliage right here protruding directly towards the front. It's going to be, again, very difficult to manipulate those out of the way so we can see a bit more of that trunk line without exposing the shoulder of the branches. So in that regard, that's a demerit for this side. It gets 0 points for the branches, whereas the other side gets 1 point. So now we're looking at a 2 to 2. So both sides have their merits, both sides have their demerits. Now for me personally, I think that because the branches are so good from this particular side of the tree right here, the trunk line looks nice, I think this is actually going to be the better front, despite the fact that we have an absolutely horrendous looking Nabari. Now I said before that we can correct for this, and that's actually what we're going to be talking about next. So I'm going to bring the camera in a little bit closer. We're going to figure out how we can make this Nabari look a little bit nicer here. All right, let's take a closer look at the Nabari here. So you'll notice that this root that's coming around from the back and girdling the trunk, it actually starts on the rear of the tree here, wraps around, and then it has grafted itself to another root that also starts around the back left side of the tree and wraps around. So with both of these roots, I have no idea how much fine rootage is actually attached to either one of these below the soil surface. So I can't just come through here and hack both of these off. It may kill the whole tree or it might kill portions of the tree. So what we want to do is try to both make this look aesthetically pleasing right from the get-go here and potentially weaken these roots over time so that eventually, as other fine roots start to take over, we can potentially remove both of these guys. That could be 2 years down the line, could be 5 years down the line, could be 10 years down the line. So there are a couple of ways that we can weaken these roots. One would be to take a knob cutter like this and just take a big chunk out of both of those, or maybe take a couple of smaller chunks in different areas out. That would potentially weaken this over time. The problem with that is you're going to be able to see the fact that I did that with this. It's going to look very unnatural and not very interesting at all. Now, the other option that I think is actually going to be better is to create some shari that runs down the length of both of these roots here. That will both weaken these and also give it a nice aesthetic appearance. So, like I said, that could stay on here. These roots could stay on here for, 2 to 5 years before we're able to remove them. So I want it to look as nice as possible in the interim. So doing that with a knife like this is just a standard box cutter. You can also buy specialty knives if you want, will actually do the job quite well. So what I'm going to do here is start out at the end on this big root. I'm just going to follow the line through here and create a shari. And I'm not going to make it super wide at this point. So I'm not going to take off a ton. We're going to take off somewhere between like 1/8 to 1/4 of the circumference of this right now, just to weaken this. And what that'll do is it'll then cause it to callus around the edges. Once it calluses, maybe later this summer or next year, we can widen that shari and widen it and widen it and widen it year after year after year until we actually kill that root off. So I'm just going to take the knife here, press it in, and we're just going to follow the curvature of the root here. And I'm pressing all the way down to the xylem, which is the hardwood, so that it doesn't try to completely heal itself over. If we leave any cambium intact, that cambium will then produce new phloem on the outside of that and new bark on the outside of that. So we want to get all the way down to the xylem so it doesn't actually heal itself completely back over. We just want it callusing right along the edge of the wound here. Just like so. All right, now we're going to do a similar thing to this root right here. I'm thinking what might be interesting here is instead of doing one really long shari that runs all the way down here, I'm going to do a smaller one here, stop somewhere down in here, and then we'll do another one that comes around from the back and stops somewhere in that area. So you end up with essentially 3 separate shari lines here. All right, so I think that looks pretty good for right now. So like I said, the edges of this are going to callus over the next couple of months here. And then either later in this growing season or early next growing season, we'll open this up a little bit wider, probably a good 25% more on both sides. So that again, little by little, we can start to kill off these large roots right here. So in any case, if you have a flaw like this on the tree, sometimes it's actually better just to draw your attention as much as possible to that flaw rather than eliminating it or hiding it, which is exactly what we've done in this case by adding the shari down here at the base. But like I said, in the future this will be removed, so not really that big a deal in the long run. All right, so the next thing here, we're going to zoom the camera back out and we're going to talk about designing and wiring the branches. All right, so now for my favorite part of these tutorials, and that is wiring and styling these trees. So what we're going to be using here is copper wire, and like I said before, on this tree, this well select here, the branches are already on a nice downward angle here. This is all natural. So I'm not going to have to put on a massively heavy wire to manipulate these down into position, but I do need to put on a bracing wire here so that once we get out to the secondary and tertiary branches a little further out, I have something that I can anchor onto. So what that means is I need to come back to the trunk, anchor from the trunk out onto these main branches here. Now with this particular tree, I want this to look nice and clean from the front. So I don't want a whole bunch of wire cutting across the front of the trunk here. I want it to go around the back side. And like I said, since we're not really manipulating these branches too much, I don't have to worry about going around the trunk multiple times to anchor branches on either side of the tree. What I can do is take a wire like this, go around the back side of the trunk, and then take it up and out onto a branch on the opposite side of the tree here. And that's going to provide us plenty of anchorage here because again, we're not really cranking these branches down right from the get-go. If these branches were upright and I really had to bring them down, I might take this wire all the way out and around the trunk up to a higher point on the tree just to give us a little bit more of an anchor there. But again, in trying to keep this tree aesthetically pleasing and clean looking, we don't need to do that at this stage. So I'm going to take these wires out onto the branch and then we're going to wire the secondary and some of the tertiary branches. So as I'm wiring the branches out here, I want to show you what I'm doing at the very ends of each of these branch tips. So it's really not necessary to wire every single individual shoot out here at the end or every fan of foliage. What we can do with a piece of wire like this when we get out towards the end is be a little bit more strategic about what we're actually applying the wire to. So in this example right here, I've got these two guys out here at the very end that are kind of flopping. We've got this wire that's going clockwise. So as I get to this bifurcation here, what I can do is actually take this wire out onto the branch on the right side here and loop it back under and catch the foliage on the left side. If this wire were going counterclockwise, I would have taken it out onto the one on the left side and wrapped back around towards the right. Now, to make this look a little cleaner, of course, we can cut this back, but what this allows us to do now is drop this branch down and lift the entire tip of the branch up, get everything in the proper position without actually having to wire each individual small branch. So it saves a lot of time. It can also be a little bit detrimental on Hinoki Cypress to wire all of the tertiary branches. Sometimes those will die off, so the least amount of wire you can put on the tree, the better. All right, so now for probably the most difficult part of the tree, and that is building the apex here. So you'll notice we actually lopped the top off of this tree about a year ago when it was brought down. That was to make it a little bit easier to transport and then also to provide a little less transpiration problems with the tree. So in other words, there was a lot of foliage at the top. We cut that back, keeps the lower growth alive instead of the tree naturally dropping the lower branches in favor of the apex. So it has been flat cut here. Now, I'm not going to work on this flat cut area right now because we are in the middle of the summer here and we are going to be putting a pretty decent bend up here in the top. So I don't want to potentially kill our apex off by trying to smooth this area out right now. We'll do that maybe later this year or perhaps even into next year, depending on how the top responds here. So what we're going to be doing here is taking the apex, whipping it back down and around and then laying it on top of itself here, essentially to create a nice kind of rounded top. So what is the current apex will actually become a lateral branch. Maybe it ends up back here, maybe it ends up off to the right side here. And all of these secondary branches here will actually be flopped over to become the new rounded top to the tree. So let's try this out. Okay, so this is the Hinoki Cypress after its initial styling. Now you'll notice that I haven't done a whole lot of detail to this tree. It's mainly just getting the primary and some of the secondary structure into place. Now, over the course of the rest of this growing season, we're going to continue to fertilize this tree using something called Grow Power here, which is a 12-8-8, so quite high on the nitrogen. That will cause us to flush out with a nice heavy set of secondary growth that we can then actually prune back in a similar manner again in September, maybe mid to late September. It's a good opportunity to do that. That will then flush out one more time into the fall, and it will harden off by the time we go dormant here in late November, early December. So basically we're getting 3 full flushes of growth on our Hinoki Cypress over the course of one growing season. So I'll be able to get this guy to fill in very quickly just over this one season. Once we get into next year and in subsequent years, it'll just fill in more and more. And then it'll be a matter of actually keeping it pruned back enough so it doesn't feel too heavy and we don't lose that sort of soft, elegant feel to the tree. Now, another thing we're going to do following this styling is put the tree back out in the garden, but we're going to put it under partial shade. So we've got 30% shade cloth here that we put these trees underneath. If you don't have a shade cloth like that, as long as you got an area where you can get morning sun and afternoon shade, that'll be absolutely plenty. These guys tend to like a little bit of shade anyway, so even if you aren't styling a tree like this at this time of year, it's still better to keep your Hinoki Cypress in a little bit of shade. Again, morning sun, afternoon shade if you can. As I mentioned earlier in the demonstration, these guys like to stay a little bit on the moist side as well, so we water this guy twice a day, once in the morning, once later in the afternoon. That will be dictated to some degree in your environment by the actual climate and the weather there, as well as the type of soil that you're using. So if you're using a pretty free draining mix like what we have here, and you live in a hot climate like we do here, you're gonna have to water a little bit more frequently, so keep that in mind. I hope you guys liked this episode of Bonsai-U. If you like what we do here, make sure to like and subscribe down below. And if you really want to support us monetarily, you can click on the link in the description down below. It'll bounce you over to my website and you can make a donation to help us going forward. Till the next episode though, take care.